Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Jenny Parker, and I'm the Chief Communications Officer at American Promise, and this is Beyond the Headlines, where we take a hard look at how money in politics is changing American elections. As always, I am joined by Brian Boyle, Chief Program Officer and General Counsel at American Promise. Brian, today we're looking at a major development in the movement to address money in politics, the introduction of House Joint Resolution 191, a constitutional amendment that would restore the authority of Congress and the states to set reasonable rules for money in elections. This is pretty exciting. Are you ready to dig in?
I'm excited for it, Jenny. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. Let's just start with this. First of all, what exactly was introduced into Congress?
Sure. So toward the beginning of June, Congressman Tom Barrett from Michigan introduced something called House Joint Resolution 191. And that resolution proposes an amendment to the United States Constitution that would restore the power of the states and Congress to decide the rules around campaign finance and money in politics. So this is the type of resolution that, if it were to achieve the necessary 2/3 support from all members of the House and all members of the Senate, then that language would become a proposed constitutional amendment that gets sent back to the states for formal ratification. So it's a really great development.
Okay, and then remind us, across parties, people know money in politics is a problem. Remind us why the solution is a constitutional amendment.
Sure, absolutely. Well, one of the concepts I like to use to tee this up is really the question of who decides. I think most Americans, if you were to ask them who should be able to decide whether or not we have some guardrails around money in politics, they would think, well, we should be able to decide. We, the American people, should decide, and our elected lawmakers should be able to decide. But for the past 50 years, it has really been judges and the Supreme Court that are deciding these types of campaign finance policy questions. And the Supreme Court is doing that as an interpretation of the First Amendment. And so, in a nutshell, the Supreme Court has constitutionalized campaign finance policy, made it an area where they, the judges, get to decide, and that has had the effect of stripping power and authority from the American people and their lawmakers at the state and federal level. And the only way to fix that is through a constitutional amendment to make it clear that the American people should have this authority restored.
So one thing that surprises a lot of people about this movement is that it started in the states. Amendments are supposed to come from Congress. Why are we starting in the states?
Well, I think on the one hand, when you say amendments are supposed to come from Congress, you might be thinking, well, Congress proposes amendments, right? So it starts there. But in actuality, one thing that we've learned from history and also from speaking with folks who've been involved in prior efforts to amend the Constitution, so much constitutional change actually starts from the states and bubbles up. And then Congress takes notice and then does something by proposing an amendment that responds to what the states and the people in the states are telling them they want. And so the reason that we have been sort of asking states to go on the record in support of such an amendment is so that we can then take that state support and show members of Congress that there's an appetite out there in the country for a constitutional amendment. And then the other reason why it makes sense for it to bubble up from the states is that the people of the states are really kind of the last stop when it comes to constitutional change, because the amendment gets sent back to the states where the states are going to ratify the amendment. And so you need to make sure that people are aware of what the amendment says and what the purpose is, and that they are ready to sign in favor of the amendment when it is back before them.
So basically, if you're going to end in the states, you better start there too.
That's a good way of saying it.
It makes sense. It makes sense. So how's that working out for you? What's the momentum like in the states?
This is a really exciting year for American Promise and the amendment movement in general, because we are seeing interest in the amendment solution accelerate in the states and also on Capitol Hill. So in the first half of 2026, 2 new states have come on record in support of an amendment solution, Oklahoma and Idaho. And both states did it with really overwhelming legislative majorities. And then I just mentioned we had Congressman Barrett's introduction of a resolution. And that is in addition to several other versions of an amendment that addresses money in politics that have been introduced by various Democrats. So if I could sort of wrap it all up into one idea, I think it's that the country is sensing the need for constitution level change, and more voices in support of that change are emerging.
Okay, great. And I know from when we've passed these resolutions or when we've worked with the states to pass the resolutions, uh, federalism is almost always mentioned in the text of the resolutions. Remind us about the connection between federalism and this amendment solution movement.
Yeah, well, federalism is really the idea that power should be distributed throughout the country, and that where possible, decisions should be made at the most local level possible, because that kind of goes back to this sense of whether people's interests are being represented by their lawmakers and whether people can actually be self-governing. So just to make this really concrete, you wouldn't want Congress setting the budget for road paving in the city or town that you live in, right? You're going to want your city or town to do that. You wouldn't necessarily want Congress to be creating a criminal code for the state that you live in. You want the state legislature to be in charge of that. You also wouldn't want individual states making decisions about whether the United States military goes to war. That's a decision for Congress. So federalism acknowledges that different decisions should be made by different levels of government. But for the most part, the things that affect our day-to-day lives, those decisions should be handled by states and localities. And the way that this connects to money in politics is that over the past several decades, as sort of big money in politics has become more prominent, as concentrated wealth has been able to spend big money in elections, you've seen a nationalization of campaign finance. And that has the effect of actually interfering with local self-government. So again, to try to make it concrete, if you have, one billionaire in Texas or California or New York who can spend tons of money in a local election to get their candidates into office, that will affect which issues are on the agenda in those elections. And so if you restore the ability of the people to set guardrails on money in politics, you can also hopefully try to reduce some of this hyper nationalization of campaign finance.
So in this movement, we see there's a broad agreement across parties that money in politics is a problem. There's also broad agreement in support of the amendment solution. Why is that so important?
I think it's important for a few reasons. One is if you just look at what is the math that's required to amend the Constitution, you require supermajority support. You need 2/3 support in Congress, and then you need 3/4 of the states to ratify. And in our current political climate, that you can't achieve those supermajority levels without both parties, right? It has to be some amount of people across the spectrum coming together in support of a solution. So there's the political math of it, but I think at a deeper level, what is driving concern about money in politics is the sense that our system is no longer representing our interests as ordinary Americans. And that's a concern that people have regardless of whether they're Republican, Democrat, Independent, super conservative, super progressive. Like, people are tired of a system that feels out of touch increasingly, and they know that money is part of what's creating that dynamic. And so, we in state after state after state, we see that support for an amendment really spans the spectrum in terms of ideology.
One thing I noticed about Congressman Barrett's language for the amendment. It's very similar to the American Promise Model Amendment. And in particular, it's mention of artificial intelligence and other entities. How did that get in there, and why is that there, and why does that matter today?
Yeah, and just a small little nuance. So the language refers to, quote, artificial entities. And that language was included not only to capture sort of legal entities that you might think of, corporations, nonprofits, unions, the whole gamut, but we also wanted to make sure that other artificial entities, including, for example, artificial intelligence agents, could be within the scope of lawmaking authority. And, we heard concerns about this a number of years ago from folks who said, hey, we're worried about AI and where this is headed. Would the amendment allow lawmakers to address AI in its regulation of money and politics? And, after consulting with lots of different legal experts, we thought that the phrase artificial entities would give the broadest scope of power to both the states and Congress to make those decisions. Now, let me just briefly wrap up this point by saying the amendment doesn't prescribe any regulations whatsoever of artificial entities. It just leaves that choice with the states and Congress.
So at this point, this half-year mark of 2026, and as we approach July 4th, in fact, we have 25 states that have called on Congress for an amendment solution. We have introduction into Congress now. What do we need? What do you want to tell people about where the movement is right now? What do they need to know most?
I think that what people need to know is that we are entering a new session of Congress in January of 2027, where the importance of educating and advocating about the amendment will be even more important than ever. And it's because the window of opportunity has really arrived, I think. The introduction by Congressman Barrett and also introductions of other versions from other members of Congress, they really allow for a true constitutional debate about what the right language should be. So members of Congress will be involved in that. States and state legislators will be involved in that. But I think the idea of an amendment itself is starting to get normalized. And I think that this is a key year for that. And then heading into 2027, that will only accelerate. So we're going to be focused on continuing the formal congressional process, whether that looks like monitoring additional co-sponsors or potentially gearing up for hearings in the coming months. But we're also going to continue all the state level work, right? We want to get more states calling for an amendment solution. And we want to make sure that the public in general is aware of this and up to date, and they understand how the amendment would work to restore their voice in self-government.
Well, I think it's great. So congratulations to you and everybody who worked on the introduction milestone. I think that's huge. And the state milestones for that point.
Yeah.
I think it's a big moment for Americans everywhere who are so concerned about money and politics. But to your larger point, we now really have to get back to work. There's a lot more to be done. So thanks, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Brian, for joining.
Thanks, Jenny.
And be sure to stay tuned to this movement by giving us a follow. Thanks so much.
Bye.